Hello, I'm Texas State Representative Trey Martinez Fischer, and I'm the creator of this new podcast, Politex. I totally know what you're thinking, like, why do we need another podcast, right? Why do we need another form of digital communication? We have so much. I agree 100%. But let me just tell you a couple of things. I've noticed in the course of my political career that things happen so fast in Austin, it's often hard to keep up. And oftentimes we spend a good part of our day working, fighting, debating, doing our darndest to represent the values of our constituents. And after a hard day's work, we're feeling, and sometimes we're feeling pretty good that we did something good that day. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes we're commiserating and we recognize, we didn't do things so great. We got run over by the political majority and we lost. But nevertheless, we gave it our all. We left it all on the field. We fought very hard for the people we care about. So it just sort of never really occurs to me that while all this is taking place, that you're sort of left out of the process. I will come home on the weekends or, go make a public appearance or give remarks to an organization. And one of the first things that comes up is, someone says, hey, what are you doing for us? And I, kind of look a little bewildered, and I was like, well, didn't you see the article on the front page of the newspaper? Didn't you see the tweet, with the picture on the House floor where we were valiantly fighting, for this issue? And it just dawns on me that there's just this huge disconnect between the work that we do in Austin and how it gets to your front doorstep, how it makes it to the tip of your smartphone. And that's what this pod is really about. It's about, yet again, bringing another piece of information right to you and, so that you can listen, you can analyze, you can question, and more importantly, you can make your own decisions when it comes to the work that's being done for you. So listen, this is going to be a cool show. We're not going to make it, one of these stiff podcasts that, has all these fancy rules, and it's not going to be like that. That's not who I am. For those of you who know me, I like to have a little bit of fun. I work hard. I play hard. So we're going to talk about public policy, and we're going to try to do it in a very cool way. We're not going to be over the top about it. Very conversational. We're going to talk about a lot of politics, and there's a lot of politics going on. And sometimes, that is something that people, don't want to get into, but there is a lot of politics taking place at the Texas Capitol. And then, we want to make the show fun. So we're going to talk about arts. We're going to talk about culture. We're going to have fun. The music you're hearing is by none other than a very famous band from San Antonio, a very good friend of mine, Max Baca, and Los Tex Maniacs. I want to, we're going to talk to them at some point. We're excited to have their music on our show. Very proud that they would associate with us. So listen, just we look forward to engaging. I look forward to, getting some cool people on the pod and asking some cool questions and seeing what I can do to really communicate the narrative of what's happening in Austin and how we can bring it to you and what you and I can do to change the direction of the state. And so let's just put this podcast as a small weapon in the arsenal of change. And I look forward to some great moments. And I want to thank you for supporting the pod. Thank you for listening. If you have a suggestion for the show or an idea for a potential episode, I value your feedback. Email your suggestions to contact@TreyMartinezFisher.com. As always, thank you for listening to Politics. Our next guest is none other than UT professor Dr. Michael Weber. Dr. Weber does a lot of things for the university, but he's an expert when it comes to analyzing public utilities, our energy transmission system in the state of Texas, and more specifically, he's been really paying attention to the failings and shortcomings of our electricity grid here in Texas. Many people are still suffering today from the effects of these blackouts, whether it is not having power or not having water or all the damage associated with that horrific event. So Dr. Weber, we're looking forward to your discussion. Welcome to the pod. Thank you for joining us. We are now joined by Dr. Weber from the University of Texas. And I'll have to tell you, I'll be real honest with you, I became a big fan, Dr. Weber, of your work when I heard you on another podcast. And it was like, man, if I only had 20 minutes in a day to explain a horrific weather event that impacted millions of people, uh, who would I want to hang out with? And just, I have to give you kudos. Thank you for sharing, everything you know. And I think it would be great if we could just maybe walk through that conversation. But before we do that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background real quick.
Sure, great. First of all, thanks for taking the time to talk with me about these issues. I really care about energy, and I love it when other people show interest as well. And it's an important issue, as we know, from the Texas energy crisis and from everything else. So my name is Michael Weber. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been on the faculty there for 15 years. I am an Austin native. In fact, I'm sitting in my childhood bedroom right now. I bought this house from my parents. We moved in when I was 1. My father was a professor at UT, so I was a faculty rep. And then I went to UT as an undergrad. So I've been a part of the Austin community and Texas community basically forever, except for graduate school and that kind of thing. In addition to being a professor, I also am Chief Science and Technology Officer for a company called ENGIE. ENGIE is one of the world's largest energy companies headquartered in Paris, France. It has about 170,000 employees in 70 countries, and it makes a lot of electricity and sells a lot of gas and does a lot of services. And I run their research program with a couple hundred people. It's actually one of the largest clean energy research programs in the world. So I'm based in Paris, but I've been in Austin for the last year because of COVID, and kids are in school here and everything else. So I'm here in Austin and from Austin, but also working in Paris with this Parisian view. So I have an international view, which sometimes informs my thinking in Texas.
Awesome. Well, maybe later on offline, you're going to have to explain to me how you can keep a Parisian life in Austin, Texas, because I have a 12-year-old who wants to do the exact same thing. So I'll have to get some guidance.
It's worth doing. I mean, I think the beauty of being in Texas is we get to be in Texas, right? Texas is a great place and it feels like the center of the universe. The problem is we forget that there are other places beyond Texas because Texas is actually very international. Houston has more languages spoken than any other city in America. So it's good for us to go get international experience. And when I was 12, my father, a professor, took a sabbatical and we lived in Switzerland and then France a little later on. And so my wife and I thought, well, we should do that for our kids. And I encourage you to do that for your kids as well, just to get a little different exposure from what they might see from home or from Austin.
All right. No, thank you. Well, listen, let's get to the meat of our discussion. Obviously, doesn't take a lot of background to talk about the horrific winter polar vortex we had in the state of Texas. I mean, 4.5 million people without power, 15 million people without water. Just here in San Antonio, there are people today still struggling to get their claims managed, to get their water running. Something I've never seen in 50 years of my life living in the state of Texas. Can you, in describing that, can you just walk us through sort of a couple days before the storm and what you observed during the storm and why this is not a brand new occurrence?
Absolutely. And I will say that this is not just a story for Texans, it's an international story. My colleagues around the world, so I lead a team in different continents, they all are aware of what happened because it's really a stunning thing for such an energy abundant place like Texas to have an energy shortage or an energy crisis. That's a sign that we had a systemic failure, systemic planning failure, or whatever it was. And this really captures people's attention. So we can back up a little bit and I'll walk you through a sequence of things that happen. And what happens is there's a big Arctic front moving south. And this Arctic front is cold air from Canada or further north that moves south, thousands of miles further south than normal. And this happens with climate warming, you get a wobbly jet stream. And as the jet stream gets wobbly, northern air moves south further and more often than you might expect. And the cold air is coming, you see it go from state to state. So we have a couple days warning. People are worried it's going to be cold. The governor is alerted. There isn't much communication about it, unfortunately, to get people prepared. But the power plants are starting to get nervous. They're starting to ramp up. They're worried about frozen supplies of gas and everything else. As the cold air comes into Texas and the temperatures plunge below freezing, the demand for energy goes up. The demand for electricity for heating and the demand for gas for heating in our homes. And about 60% of our homes are electrically heated. The other 40% are gas and propane. And the power plants are ramping up to meet the demand, and gas is used not just for the power plants, but for the heating in our homes, but also for industry and for liquefied natural gas exports to Europe and that kind of thing. Demand for energy is really high. At some point, power plants start to trip offline because they are frozen or they have equipment that's frozen. They're not properly winterized. And at the same time that power plants are tripping offline, we have what's called freeze-offs of the natural gas system, where water and other liquids that come up with gas start to freeze at the wellheads or in the pipes, and it chokes off the supply of gas. and the choked off supply gas shuts off additional power plants. And some of those power plants that turn off the power to some of the natural gas system, because some of the natural gas system is actually electrically operated. So you have a frozen equipment problem become a gas problem, become a power problem, become a bigger gas problem, become a bigger power problem, until you have millions of people without power in different parts of the state. Everything I just described to you was what happened a decade ago to the day before this crisis in 2011. And we had a repeat, but this time it was colder for longer and in more parts of Texas. So it's as if we didn't really learn much. And there are all these cascading failures of one system to another, poor planning, and a lot of risk. Unfortunately, people die. For a lot of us, it's just uncomfortable for a while, but there's a lot of economic damage, a lot of burst pipes, that kind of thing. So this is what happened. It also happened in 1989. It also happened in 1983. It feels like we're slow learners sometimes.
Well, indeed, I mean, and again, I mean, that's exactly what happened. I mean, I can go back to 2011. I'm sure you can go back a lot further, but it was almost like Groundhog Day. This happened before, and power companies lost power, the grid froze, and in the autopsy, looking backward, the best practice was, you need to get prepared. You need to winterize. You need to make sure that we're doing everything to prevent this from happening again. Did it happen?
It did happen at some places, but I would say it clearly did not happen enough. So some companies actually did winterize. Austin Energy winterized, their municipal utility. El Paso did. San Antonio did some. The University of Texas did, and some of the big operators did winterize. But not everybody winterized, and even those who winterized still struggled. They still lost some capacity. I know one power plant operator where they had a capacitor freeze, and that tripped off a steam turbine, but they still had their gas turbines working. So even winterized power plants had trouble because it was pretty cold for quite a while. But we clearly need more power plants to winterize, and we need the natural gas system to winterize, like they do in North Dakota or Canada, where they produce natural gas in cold weather, so that the natural gas system doesn't freeze up. Because if the natural gas supply cuts off, that turns off even more power plants. You get additional failures or more problems from that.
Right, and I think that's a comment I heard you mention is like, hey, well, listen, there's cold weather in Iowa and the Dakotas, and things are moving just fine. It's because they've prepared for this, they've winterized for this, they've built their infrastructure to understanding the changing conditions of the climate, and we just haven't done that in Texas. I mean, is that, or to a substantial degree, is that fair?
We haven't done it enough for sure, and a lot of it's partly rational. We don't plan for it. We think, well, it's hot 4 months of the year and cold 3 weeks of the year. It's not that cold those few weeks. And we only have a real deep freeze once every 40 years, except that it feels like we're starting to have them every 10 years. And the climate projections are more like every 5 to 8 years. So if you start to think you have a really cold deep freeze every handful of years, as opposed to every handful of decades, your cost benefit analysis might be a little bit different. It might be worth the money because it costs money to winterize. It might be worth it because then you can make a lot of money when your power plant is running, but the others are shut down.
And so, look, this show is, part policy, it's part politics. And I mean, my job every day is to sort of just, get to the bone and figure out what is going on. I listened to most of the 25 hours of legislative testimony. And the most shocking thing that I discovered was that by two witnesses, Governor Abbott knew about this event at least 2 days and perhaps maybe even 3 days before it happened. And from what I can gather, and this is my opinion, didn't really do anything to notify other folks like my mayor in San Antonio, my county judge. And understand, I mean, as you probably know, San Antonio has a culture of preparing for disasters. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, we opened our doors. We opened our convention centers. We fed people. We housed people. We provided them shelter and care. 72 hours before disaster is a mini lifetime. And I'm thinking about the number of things we could have done as a community to prepare for this vortex. We could have saved some lives. I mean, what's your perspective?
I absolutely. I think that one of the biggest absences I've noticed is not just the absence of winterization, but the absence of emergency preparedness communications. And this is something we should expect from state leadership. And it was silent. And this is the type of thing I follow, I would have noticed, and I didn't notice it. And in fact, I did this, and some of my students did. We did more emergency communications from my research group at the University of Texas than came out of the governor's office. And I'm not really sure why. I was telling people individually that make sure you get your batteries, make sure you get some water, top off your car with gasoline. Because if there's a power outage, the gasoline stations can't pump gasoline. And be ready, make sure you have firewood if you have a fireplace. We were doing that, and I told people to do that. And I also posted this on social media to the different people who follow me on social media, like, get ready. This could really break the system. We had outages the last time this happened. Here's how you run your faucets and protect your water system and your pipes. So I was doing emergency communications. There really wasn't a lot of that. And this is a point of failure across all the agencies, I would say, that there really wasn't enough of that. And if we had done more of that, people could have been really informed that the roads are going to be icy. If you're in a place that's isolated and you need to move, now's the time to move. Like if you have a friend's house you can stay at or something like that, so you don't get trapped. That was all missing. And I think maybe it could have saved lives, but certainly could have avoided a lot of discomfort and a lot of expense for a lot of people who got trapped and were very cold.
No, that's a good point. In San Antonio, for instance, I mean, we could have created warming centers. And by the time we had time as a community to react, the proposal was, let's just take our public fleet of buses, park them outside vulnerable communities, senior citizen apartment complexes, run the buses, keep the heat on, and we can make people more comfortable. Well, by the time that was deployed, I mean, the roads were so frozen over, we couldn't do that. I mean, and that's what just really irks me to know that we could have planned better and we could have had a 72-hour heads up and we didn't get one.
But just as you say, cities can do a lot in a couple of days, and it's hard to do it after the roads are icy and the power's out.
Let me tell you another. I mean, there's two things I want to talk about, but the second thing that really boggled my mind about these hearings is that I learned in a span of 4 days, $50 billion, transferred in energy transactions, which is the exactly or almost exactly the same amount of money that was transacted in 3 years under normal conditions. So 4 days, we spent what it took 1,095 days to spend under normal conditions. There's something wrong with that, don't you think?
Yeah, this doesn't seem like a normal or a healthy market. So price spikes are part of a market. That's part of what incentivizes certain behavior, whether it's demand reduction and efficiency or whether it's to build more supply. So price spikes and volatility are a healthy part of a market. But when prices go that high for that long, that means there's something else going on. And in particular, this case with the electric market, prices went to the cap, which is $9,000 per megawatt hour. Normally, prices are like $20 to $40 per megawatt hour. So this is a big increase. And power plants weren't coming online, and demand was no longer getting shed. So that's a sign that power plants weren't available at any price. You could have been paying infinite dollars per megawatt hour, and the power plant wasn't available. So there's a breakdown in the market where market theory really requires a lot of entrants or participants in the market. And we didn't have enough participants in the market because they were frozen or they couldn't get the natural gas they needed. So this was a real breakdown of the system. I have a feeling there's a lot of discussion of repricing and clawbacks and things like that go back. Some watchdog just put out a comment a couple hours ago that there was a $16 billion overcharge by ERCOT out of that $50 billion. So I'm sure a lot of people are going to start looking at what was charged and whether that was reasonable and fair. But any way you slice it, that's a lot of money. And that's just the electric bill. There's also the gas bill, which we don't know yet. Will probably be billions. And then we have all the damage that happened from the burst pipes, the lost crops, the lost economic activity, which easily will be tens of billions. And people estimate that that will be something like a Hurricane Harvey event. Hurricane Harvey was 132 billion. So if you add in tens of billions of a surprise electric bill, billions for a surprise gas bill, tens of billions of damage, this is in total just a dramatic event. And we had Harvey just a few years ago. The 2 years before that, we had the Tax Day flood, Memorial Day flood in Houston. We had the epic freeze in 2011 and the epic drought that year that killed 300 million trees and did tens of billions of damage. We can't afford these kinds of disasters every 3 years. It's time for us to plan with a little bit more of an eye towards the future is what I would say.
No, and that's a really good point. And again, I mean, this is really shocking, and it's very difficult from a policy perspective to tackle. There's no one silver bullet that's going to fix this thing. I mean, you're going to need, a battalion of silver bullets to really address this, which kind of, brings me to the point. I mean, there's been a lot of finger pointing in this discussion, and I fully believe, and yet most of the finger pointing has been, this is not me, it's the other person, right? And so we had the governor pointing fingers at ERCOT, would not acknowledge the failure to communicate and regulate at the PUC. Some would say because the people running the Public Utility Commission are people that were his former employees that he personally appointed to oversee that regulation. Some people would say that. Other folks, have a quick tendency to say, well, it's not natural gas. We had all the gas in the world. We just didn't have generators that could generate. And of course, you have, the generators, and these are all the retail folks that you see on the bill, explaining why they couldn't power their generators because the gas didn't meet, sufficient standards of pressure and quality and so forth. But can you help, just the average listener? People come home, they want to flip on their light switch, they want to turn on their TV, and when it doesn't happen, it's Austin Energy's problem, it's City Public Services problem in San Antonio, and while they're not perfect in their own respects, I don't lay blame at their feet. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think Jackie Sargent, the CEO of Austin Energy, and Paula Gold-Williams, the CEO of CPS, did the best with what they had. I think the municipal utilities actually overperformed compared to the rest of the state. They had made some of the investments they needed to winterize, so their power plants were less likely to have outages. So I think the munis actually did just fine. Now, that might not feel good to you if you're in San Antonio and Austin and your power was out, because the cities had to shed a lot of power. They shed more power than they had lost. So you can think of the cities as being good neighbors and helping propping up the state, which is kind of the right way to think about it. I think that's sort of a true statement. And so there's a lot of blame going to them because they're the CEOs of the utilities, but they actually overperformed. But in some respects, people don't care. They're just angry they didn't have what they had. They didn't have what they expected with the electricity and gas. So there's a lot of blame, but there's also a lot of blame to go around because there are a lot of mistakes. So ERCOT and WIND get a lot of the blame, but ERCOT, frankly, doesn't have a lot of the authority it needs to make sure power plants are winterized. WIND deserves some blame because they had ice and blades and didn't perform. The solar panels didn't do great when it was snowing. Coal plants tripped off because they had frozen equipment and frozen coal piles. A nuclear power plant tripped off because of frozen equipment. Tens of gigawatts of natural gas plants either froze or couldn't get the gas, and the whole gas system froze up. Everybody underperformed except for hydroelectric, which actually overperformed a little bit. But we have so little hydro in Texas, it helps save the grid for a few seconds, but isn't enough to get us out of the blackouts. So there is a lot of blame to go around. But I feel like if there's a couple things we have to look for is why do we allow the gas system to freeze up so often, yet we build a system that's dependent on it? So if you look at the one thing our grid's most dependent on in Texas, it's gas. Gas is a substantial fraction of our generations, about half of our generation over the course of a year, which is more than in the typical states or the rest of the nation. So we're more reliant on gas than most states. And the gas system has frozen up multiple times before, as we discussed 2021, just a few weeks ago, but also 2011 and in prior times. And we don't regulate gas, so for the most part, on this kind of performance standard. And it's regulated by the Railroad Commission. And so all eyes are on ERCOT, but ERCOT doesn't regulate the gas supply, and ERCOT cannot make power plants winterized. So ERCOT deserves some blame around the communications. They could do their load forecasting better. There are a lot of things ERCOT can improve on, but fundamentally the mistakes weren't theirs to control. We could be frustrated with the governor's office for communications. We could be frustrated with the legislature for failing to give the authority to ERCOT to do these things. So there's plenty of blame to go around. Unfortunately, that doesn't help. And I think we go from the phase of who's at fault. We'll do a longer multi-month analysis, more like a forensic investigation for legal proceedings, insurance claims about the sequence of what failed when. That takes about 3 to 6 months. In 2011, we had the grid failure at the beginning of February. The big report came out in August 2011, about 6 months later, that went through all the details of the problems. And I think we'll have the similar kind of process this time, where some of the hearings are slowing down. We're going to move into the investigation phase. We'll get a big report in a few months that will tell us who failed in what way, and there'll be many failures. And the question is, will we take corrective action or not? And so all this to say, like, there's plenty of blame to go around. But if there's the one thing we really need to do, I would say, is we need to build our infrastructure for the weather of the future, not the weather of the past. That's the mistake we're making, is we're building for the wrong kind of weather. We're not really appropriately designing the system for the weather we're going to have. We're designing for the system to be there for the weather we want to have, and that's just a failure waiting to happen.
And just, I'm interested in your thought and sort of, let's talk moonshot policy now. I mean, I've been in politics, a couple of decades now, and it's tough to fight these special interests, and it's even tougher to fight them when they have political allies that happen to be in the political majority. Given sort of that political inertia that you have to work through to bring some sensible reforms, is it time for us to start talking about tying into the national grid?
I mean, there are a couple things that divide the parties or political leanings, but there are also a couple things that unite us. In Texas, we like to make money from our land. We like to make money from energy. We like reliability. We like to build stuff. We like to build infrastructure. These are things that Democrats and Republicans in Texas have agreed on for decades. And I think there's a way forward with all that, which is, well, let's build more infrastructure, transmission lines and things like that, winterize our power plants, so let's invest in our infrastructure. let's connect that infrastructure to other grids, east and west, so that we can export a lot of wind and solar power and make a lot of money exporting clean electrons during the year. And then that 1 hour out of every 1,000, we might need reliability help from them, or they need reliability help from us. We prop each other up, and we're good neighbors with our states. So this ties into the idea that we have a lot of land, a lot of resource, and a lot of it's really clean, and we could help other states decarbonize for a handsome profit while improving our reliability. Well, this taps into all the things we care about. And I say, if you look at Texas, we've built more transmission lines and more power plants than any other state in the last 15 years. We can build stuff, and we can build at scale. We're starting to hit the limits of our grid, though, where we can't keep building stuff on our grid because we don't have enough customers in our grid alone. But if we could sell our power to Californians, I mean, they come here and drive up our real estate prices. Let's sell them electricity and get some of that money back. Let's do this for every other state that wants to decarbonize but doesn't have the wind and solar resource or the geothermal or the natural gas that we do. So we can help other states hit their carbon goals, make a lot of money, improve our reliability, and build some stuff. And all of that will have good economic recovery benefits because we're still struggling with COVID. Oil and gas have been hit especially hard by COVID. So I think there are some things we can do. And I think this should fit in with the energy industry's desire to make money from energy and to make energy from building stuff. And there's a way to do it without necessarily triggering federal oversight. So we just have to figure out what the rules are. But we already have some connections without federal oversight and some more that are proposed. So I'm a big fan of, like, let's build it. Let's make money cleaning up the environment. And we can do it more easily than Indiana or other states. And they want our power. Let's do this.
Yeah, well, it just seems to me, there's this reluctance or outright refusal to, work with our federal partners. But the minute we have a disaster, we want a disaster declaration right away. We want loans, we want money, we want this, want that. You can't have it both ways. And so I'm starting to look at this issue, more acutely. And I would say if we have a vulnerable grid, it's a national security issue. We have a major military assets in the state of Texas, in San Antonio specifically. We are focusing our national and cybersecurity. If we can't keep the laptops running, we're not going to be that great, to defending the homeland, right?
The huge national security implications, and even if we say we're independent as a grid, we're not isolated, which means what's happening here will affect energy prices in other states. Energy prices in California went up, and their grid is separate than our grid because of what was happening in our grid, affecting gas prices, affecting energy prices in California. Also, if the Texas energy system goes down, then airports in Atlanta can't get jet fuel. And this happens with hurricanes, other things. Like, other states depend on us to provide them energy, and our energy system depends on it working. We can't get the energy to other states unless our energy system is working. So I think it is a national security issue. There's also like a good neighborly issue. It'd be good for us to help our neighboring states when they need it, and vice versa. This isn't a bad thing. This seems like a very American thing to do. And we could even do this with Mexico. We have 2 DC ties. So we have 2 small interconnections with Mexico. We could help them as a good neighbor, and they could help us. So I think it's just one more way to do trade. And I would say, by the way, we love to sell refined fuels like gasoline. We sell crude oil. We sell natural gas. We sell wood pellets. We sell energy of every form except for electricity. For some reason, we don't want the electrons to cross the state border, but I really think we should treat electricity the same we do the other forms of energy and use it as a profit center for the state.
Well, Dr. Weber, as always, I mean, you could just run a master class on just the things you write down on a single sheet of paper in your notes. And I really appreciate you taking the time, and more specifically, sort of making it conversational. I mean, this is very complex stuff. I've been reviewing, a lot of gas contracts here lately, and I thought it was difficult for me to just read my utility bill at home when it came time to paying my monthly bill. And this is complex stuff. And anytime you can break it down and kind of spoon feed it to us and so that we can understand, I mean, that's what's helpful. And I think that in connecting with this listening audience, I mean, that is the goal of this pod, is to take some wonky policy, and break it down and overlay with a little bit of politics and let people choose and decide for themselves, who's helping them and who's in the way. And so I think you've done a tremendous service, to the listening audience, and just want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for making time to join me on this pod today.
My pleasure, and I agree with you. I think that Texans make good decisions if they're given good information, and we should trust their judgment. So let's make sure they have good information.